Step through the gatehouse, past the murder holes and the portcullis. Leave the world of siege and storm behind you. Now listen, hear that? It's not the clang of steel, but the clatter of pots. It's not the shout of soldiers, but the laughter of children and the murmur of prayer. Smell that? It's not pitch and fear, but baking bread, roasting meat, and the faint, sweet scent of rushes on the floor. This is the castle's other heartbeat. This is the castle as a home. A noisy, smoky, vibrant, and often surprisingly comfortable home. Forget the empty ruin. Let's meet the household that brought it to life. The social and physical heart of the castle was the Great Hall. This wasn't just a dining room. It was the parliament, court, theater, and community center all in one. During the day, it might host the Lord's Court, where he dispensed justice to tenants. Merchants might spread their wares on trestle tables. At night, it transformed. The central hearth or a massive wall fireplace would be lit. Long tables and benches were set up. Here, the entire household, from the lord and lady down to the lowliest scullion, would eat together in a strict order of precedence that mirrored medieval society itself. The high table on a dais was for the lord's family and honored guests. The rest of the hall filled with knights, men-at-arms, servants, and visiting retainers. This daily ritual wasn't just about food. It was about binding the household together, reinforcing loyalty, and displaying the Lord's generosity. The quality of bread, the amount of meat, even the type of ale served, were all public statements of wealth and status. Speaking of food, let's venture to the engine room of domestic life, the kitchens. In early castles, cooking might happen in the hall itself. But by the 13th century, larger castles had separate, dedicated kitchen blocks, often connected to the hall by a covered passageway. These were serious workplaces. You'd find multiple fireplaces for different tasks. Roasting spits turned by small boys or clockwork jacks, boiling cauldrons suspended on cranes, and bread ovens built into the wall. The kitchen staff, led by the head cook, was a specialized brigade. Butchers, bakers, saucers, sauce makers, and scullions worked in organized chaos. Historical kitchen accounts list staggering quantities: hundreds of loaves of bread, dozens of cattle, sheep and poultry, and barrels of ale and wine for a single week's household consumption. Feeding a castle was a major logistical operation, a peacetime siege against hunger. But where did everyone sleep? The popular image of everyone bedding down in the hall is only partly true. The lord and his immediate family enjoyed private chambers, known as the solar. This was a suite of rooms, usually on the first floor above the hall, offering more warmth, privacy, and light. Here, the lord would conduct private business, and the lady would manage the domestic affairs of the castle. The solar might be furnished with a proper bed, a mark of immense status, chests for clothes and valuables, and perhaps even a private latrine or garderobe built into the wall. For everyone else, sleeping arrangements were flexible. Knights and higher servants might have small, shared chambers in the gatehouse or towers. Many others would simply roll out pallets or mattresses stuffed with straw on the hall floor after the tables were cleared. Privacy, as we understand it, was a luxury for the very few. Another critical space was the chapel. No castle of any importance was without one. It could be a simple alcove or an elaborate freestanding building within the bailey. The chapel served the spiritual needs of the household, but it was also a statement of piety and a place for quiet reflection away from the hall's bustle. The Lord's chaplain was a key member of the household, often acting as a clerk and tutor as well. The chapel's decorations, a painted altarpiece, stained glass, or fine liturgical objects, were among the castle's most valuable and beautiful possessions, a direct link to the divine and to artistic beauty amidst the martial surroundings. Then, there were the workaday spaces that kept the castle running. The stables for scores of horses, the workshops for the blacksmith, carpenter, and fletcher, the granaries and storage cellars, the garderobe chutes that emptied into the moat or a cesspit. The well, the absolute lifeline, often housed in a protective structure. This was a vertical village, a self-contained ecosystem where hundreds of people lived, worked, prayed, and played. The castle wasn't just a lord's home, It was the economic and administrative hub of his entire estate. The business of farming, justice, and taxation was conducted here, making it a building of both policy and domesticity. So, the next time you see a stark ruined wall, imagine it plastered and whitewashed, hung with colorful tapestries to dampen drafts and show off wealth. Imagine the wooden screens at the hall's end, carved with intricate patterns, shielding the kitchen passage. Imagine the spaces buzzing with the mundane, joyful, and complex business of life. The castle was a fortress, yes, but first and foremost, it was a household. And that household had to eat, sleep, pray, and find a moment of comfort, even within walls 10 feet thick. Beyond the stone and timber, the true character of the castle home was defined by its people and their intricate social ballet. The medieval household was a rigid, yet intimate hierarchy where everyone knew their place, from the lord and lady right down to the turnspit dog in the kitchen. Understanding this social engine is key to seeing the castle not as a museum piece, but as a living, breathing community. At the top sat the lord. In peacetime, his role shifted from warlord to administrator and performer. His day was spent hearing petitions, managing his estates through stewards, hunting in his forests, a vital source of food and sport, and crucially, hosting. Hospitality was a sacred duty and a political tool. A constant stream of guests, other nobles, knights, bishops, and traveling dignitaries, required lodging, feasting, and entertainment. Their stay reinforced alliances, displayed wealth, and spread the lord's reputation. The castle was a stage, and the lord was its leading actor. But often, the true manager of the domestic sphere was the lady of the castle. Her role was monumental and multifaceted. She was responsible for the entire smooth running of the household, a CEO of domestic life. She oversaw the kitchens, the brewing, the baking, the dairy, and the laundry. She managed the budget for food and supplies, a task documented in meticulous household roles like that of Eleanor de Montfort. She supervised the upbringing of the children and the conduct of the many servants. In the lord's absence, she could be left in command of the castle's defense, a responsibility many noble women shouldered with formidable capability. Her chambers were not just a retreat, they were the nerve center of domestic power, where the threads of daily life were woven together. The household staff formed a small army of specialization. Beyond the kitchen brigade, there was the chamberlain who managed the lord's private chambers and wardrobe, the steward who oversaw the estates and finances, and the constable responsible for the military garrison. There were grooms, gardeners, falconers, minstrels, and fools. Each played a part in the ecosystem. Life in service was hard and regimented, but it offered security, a sense of belonging, and for some, a path to advancement. Their lives were bound by the castle's rhythms, from the morning mass to the final locking of the gates at curfew. Amidst the work, there was also leisure and culture. Castles were not cultural deserts. After dinner in the hall, entertainment might be provided. Minstrels would play harps, lutes, and pipes, singing tales of chivalry and romance. Jongleurs might juggle or perform acrobatics. Games like chess, backgammon, and dice were popular. For the ladies and knights, there was the intricate art of courtly love and poetry. These moments of recreation were vital for morale and social bonding, a release from the formalities of rank and the ever-present weight of stone. As the later Middle Ages progressed, a profound shift occurred. With the gradual centralization of royal power and the changing nature of warfare, the castle's primary function began to evolve from fortress to palace. The focus moved from sheer defensibility to display, comfort, and sophistication. This is when we see the birth of the castle palace. Architecture reflected this change. Walls remained, but they became more decorative. Windows grew larger to let in light, often filled with expensive glass and offering spectacular views. Fireplaces became more elaborate, with decorated mantels and chimneys that actually worked well. Gardens were laid out within the walls for leisure, with herbs, flowers, and turf seats. Great towers, keeps, were sometimes abandoned for more comfortable hall ranges with suites of luxurious private apartments. Interior decoration blossomed. Wall paintings depicting biblical scenes or heroic tales covered plastered walls. Wooden paneling kept out drafts. Intricately carved timber roofs soared overhead. Tapestries, the ultimate movable wealth, provided insulation and told stories in wool and silk. Floors might be covered in glazed tiles with geometric or heraldic patterns. The goal was to create an environment that spoke of refinement, lineage, and cultured power. The castle was becoming a canvas for artistry. This evolution tells a broader story. It marks the transition from a society where local military strength was paramount to one where centralized authority, law, and courtly culture held greater sway. The castle adapted, as it always had. It began to shed its prickly, defensive shell to reveal a more comfortable, proud, and artistic creature beneath. It became a home not just in the sense of shelter, but in the sense of a legacy, a permanent, beautiful statement of a family's place in the world. So, when we look at a castle like Bodiam in England or Langeais in France, with their reflective moats and picturesque towers, we are seeing this final, graceful stage. They are castles that speak of defense in a whisper and of domestic ambition in a shout. They remind us that these structures were always dwellings for human dreams. Dreams of security, yes, but also dreams of beauty, order, and a legacy carved in stone and woven into tapestry. Which figure in the medieval castle household do you think had the most challenging or fascinating role? Was it the lady managing everything, the lord performing his public duties, or perhaps the head cook feeding hundreds daily? Share your thoughts in the comments below.